Hello, so in this lesson we're going to be annotating our next poem, which is Death of a Naturalist. First of all, we're going to revise some vocabulary. So I'd like you to recall what a workhouse is, how did Dickens view the workhouses and why did he view them in that way? Think back to the work we did on To Autumn last week. In what way is To Autumn an ode? Can you think of a quotation that would show evidence of that? So I'd like you to pause the video, please, and answer those two questions. So our new word is naturalist. A naturalist is an expert in or a student of natural history. So somebody that is very knowledgeable about the natural world or somebody who has studied it a lot. Think Sir David Attenborough, for example, is someone we'd describe as a naturalist. So pause the video and jot down that definition. So think then, why might we refer to the Romantic poets as naturalists? So you can pause the video and answer that question. So the workhouses then were created as a result of the 1834 Poor Law. The government created them to try and do something about massive levels of poverty. They were supposed to, or they were sold as ways of helping the poor, but actually they were essentially slave labour camps punishing the poor for being poor. And Dickens, when his dad got into debt, when Dickens was a child, Dickens' father, mother and younger siblings were all forced to work in a debtor's prison, which was a bit like a workhouse, only you were forced to be there, whereas with a workhouse you had to choose to go to one. And Dickens was separated from his family for a year, working in a factory blackening bottles. And this experience left Dickens with a deep hatred for workhouses and feeling that what the government put in place to help the poor was inadequate. So an ode is a poem written to a particular thing or object, and John Keats liked to write poems to things. Ode to a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale are two very famous poems of his. So To Autumn is an ode because he is essentially writing the poem to autumn and in celebration to autumn. So the Romantic poets could be described as naturalists because whilst they weren't necessarily people who had, say, studied nature at university, they spent so much time among nature and involving themselves in nature and worshipping the natural world that they had that deep sort of love, respect and understanding of it. So today we're going to be looking at Death of a Naturalist. We're going to be looking at how Seamus Heaney uses language to present the themes of nature and childhood. So you can pause the video and jot down that knowledge goal. By the end of the lesson, you will know the context of Death of a Naturalist, but also how Heaney uses language to present the themes of nature and childhood. So we're going to switch over to the visualizer now to have a little look at the context of the poem and also to annotate it. So remember, don't worry if you don't have your copy in front of you. You can always look at the recording of this video to add in some of your quotes, some of your annotation, or you can just make some notes on a separate piece of paper. So as always, we know we need to start with the context. So Seamus Heaney was an Irish poet who grew up on a farm in rural, that means the countryside, Ireland. Now this is really important because like Wordsworth, who wrote the Prelude, the ice skating one, he is someone that also grew up in the countryside as a child as well. So that's important to get written down. He was born in 1939 and he died in 2013. So he's a modern poet. So like Ted Hughes, the guy that wrote Hawk Roosting, if you can remember the poem about Hawk, he's someone that we would call a neo-romantic poet. He wasn't alive during the original movement of romantic poetry. That was in the 1800s. So like Ted Hughes, we'd refer to him as a neo or a new romantic poet because he did believe in some of the same things. All of Seamus Heaney's poetry is he writes about the natural world. You know, in all of his poems. And the final thing we're going to write his 4-year-old brother tragically died in a car accident when Heaney was a boy. And because of this, lots of his poems, oh, I'm not sure if that's my pen running out entirely or just having a moment, are about a loss of innocence. So what we have here is that he was an Irish poet who grew up on a farm in rural Ireland. He was born in 1939, but died in 2013. So he's a modern poet and therefore a neo-romantic poet rather than one of the original romantic poets. He writes about the natural world. And because his 4-year-old brother died in a car accident when Heaney was a boy, lots of his poems are about the loss of innocence. Because when you experience something tragic like that, it's going to sort of affect the way you view the world and make you lose that childhood innocence. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to jot that down if you haven't already, and then we'll start looking at the poem. Okay. Remember, I'm recording this lesson, so if there's any bit of the annotation that goes too quickly for you, you can always go back into the lesson and rewatch a bit of it as well. But I'm just aware that we have about half an hour left. Okay, and please do unmute yourself or type a comment at any time if I'm going too fast or if there's anything that you don't understand. So, if we zoom out a minute, we can see that this is quite a long poem. What we have is we have it in two sections. This first section and then this second section here. This first section shows one view of nature, and by the time we get to this second section, this second stanza, we see a different view of nature. So, death of a naturalist then. So we're going to look firstly, as we always do, at the titles. So we know a naturalist is someone who loves nature. Then we have to look at this idea of death. Well, yes, death can mean literally dying, but death can also represent something ending. So that should be together. So essentially what we have then from this title is this is a poem about someone's love of nature ending. And that is essentially what this poem is about. And we can get all of that from the title, Death of a Naturalist. This is a poem about someone who used to love nature, losing that love of nature. And we're going to see in more detail as we read the poem why and how that love of nature is lost. Now, this is quite a long poem, so we're only going to focus on sort of bits of it, okay? We're not going to be writing loads and loads for every line, or we'll be here forever. So all year, the flax dam festered in the heart of the townland. Now, I just want to explain to you what a flax dam is. So what we have is vegetation growing around a pond, because he refers to quite a lot of vocabulary here, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you're not sure what a flax dam is. So think about, is it the Tillingham River? Between, some of you may well walk past it on your way to school. There's always certain types of plants that grow around a river or a pond or a body of water. So that's what he's referring to here with the flax dam. So it festered in the heart of the townland. Green and heavy-headed flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. So we're going to focus on this word, festered and rotted. Now, if something's rotting, is we have this disgusting image, but also smell of rotting plants. And you get it when it's really hot in the summer. Hard to imagine it being really hot when it's so frosty today. But you get that really disgusting smell of all of the plants sort of rotting, particularly in the heat. So this is the first sort of image. It's a sensory image because it's this idea of a smell, this smell of rotting plants. However, what we also have is this idea of something being green. Green is more positive, and I'm actually going to go and get another coloured highlighter. Hang on. Because what we have in this poem is we have a mixture of positive and negative words. So amongst all this negative, we have the positive. It's green. Now we associate things that are green with being pretty. Again, everything's full of life. But we also have that compared to rotted. So what we see in this first verse is this constant going backwards and forwards between positive images of nature and negative images of nature. So we're going to identify them first of all, and then I'll tell you a little bit about why the poet has done that. So green and heavy-headed flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. So huge sods are just clumps of earth. Okay? So don't worry too much about that. Daily, it sweltered in the punishing sun. So again, we have this idea of a negative image. It's really, really hot. The sun is punishing. So bubbles gargled delicately. We have again this mixture of positive and then negative. Bubbles and delicately are very positive images, but gargled is quite disgusting. So what we have is a mixture of positive and negative images of nature. Blue bottles wove a strong gauze of sound around the smell. So blue bottles are, again, flies. Okay. We tend to associate flies with, you know, things that are disgusting as well. You know, if there's like rotting food left over somewhere, there's normally like flies on it. And they're making this strong sort of buzzing sound in this pond. There were dragonflies, so again positive, and spotted butterflies. So these are very beautiful. You know, we have this very beautiful image of these dragonflies and these butterflies. I hope everyone is okay and with me. It's very bizarre having you all sitting there silent. So again, do please unmute yourself if you're completely baffled by what I'm going on about. So what Heaney's doing here is he's building up this really sort of complicated image in our minds of this pond and all of the natural sort of habitats of these plants and these insects. So now we get onto the subject of the poem, but best of all, so what he loves the most was the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water in the shade of the banks. So this little boy loves collecting frog spawn. Frog spawn is frogs' eggs. They look like these tiny little bits of jelly. And maybe when you were little, your primary school teacher brought some frog spawn in and you saw them turn into tadpoles, or maybe you even did it yourself when you were young. But that is essentially what this first bit of the poem is about. This little boy loves collecting frog spawn, and he loves sort of the disgusting bits of nature. And young children love disgusting, slimy things. My own children are obsessed with slime that you can buy in little tubs, and it's absolutely disgusting, but they love it because they're small children. So what we have here is this little boy, and he's probably 5, 6 years old. The thing that he loves the most is going to this pond that Heaney's described, putting his hand into these ponds and picking up this frog spawn. But it's described in a very disgusting way. Warm, thick slobber, grew like clotted water. Think of, I don't know, milk that's been left in the fridge too long and starts going in disgusting little clumps. That's what this simile, you know, clotted water here, you know, so it's very disgusting. But the little boy doesn't view it as disgusting because the little boy is innocent. He views it as fun. He loves it. But an older child or an adult would view it as disgusting. So what we have here, and I'm just going to sort of do this in a little box, I think, is we have the positive words equal an innocent child sort of view of nature. So we have here these sorts of positive words. They are all representing an innocent child's view of nature, but the negative words are representing how an older person might view it. So what we have here is this idea that the child, because he's innocent and young, views nature in one way, but as that child gets older, they're going to view it in this negative way that we probably are as we are reading it, because we are obviously not all 6-year-old children. And this loss of innocence and this change of view from positive to negative is essentially what we see in the second half of this poem. So what Heaney's doing is he's almost foreshadowing this change of view here with this mixture of this positive and negative. So here every spring I would fill jam pots of the jellied specks to range on windowsills at home, on shelves at school. So we don't necessarily have to write anything because it's quite obvious, but he loves filling loads of jam pots or jam jars full of this frog spawn, and he sits them on the windowsill at home, but also on the windowsill at school. So again, that's something a very little child would do. And wait and watch until the fattening dots burst into nimble swimming tadpoles. Now, fattening dots burst is quite, a violent, disgusting image. It always makes me think of, I don't know, that Alien film, which hopefully none of you have seen because it's probably not the right certificate for your age, even though I know that means nothing nowadays. But, there's a very famous old-fashioned sci-fi film where an alien bursts from someone's chest. That's what this always makes me imagine. Burst is a very violent verb. So describing the hatching of these tadpoles as these fattening dots bursting, again, it's linking into this negative older view, whereas a child would view that as exciting, letting the eggs hatch. But to an adult, this idea of bursting would be more negative. So what we have in the last little bit of this first verse is the voice of a little boy. So I'm just going to read it to you. Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog and how he croaked and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs and this was frog spawn. Now, I read that really quickly because there is no punctuation at the end of those lines. It's called, remember we looked at this in class, enjambment. Now, enjambment is where there's no punctuation at the end of a line and they run on and makes you read them quite quickly. So what this enjambment is doing is it's showing the little boys, his excitement. When little children are excited about something, they say it really, really quickly without sort of stopping to pause or think. So we have here this reflection of the almost voice, the sound of a little child. Now that's reinforced by the fact that he refers to his teacher. He calls the frogs a daddy frog and a mammy frog. So all of these is this idea of a child. We also have this final sort of sentence or few lines. You could tell the weather by frogs too, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in rain. Now, this is the sort of thing my own children, when you can get what they've learned at school out of them, they come back and tell me these random facts that they've learned. Because, of course, in the lower years of primary school, it's teaching them these little pieces of information and these little facts. So what we have in this first verse is this contrast of positive and negative representations of nature, showing the difference between an innocent child's view and then an older adult view. We have this idea of loving this disgusting, slimy frog spawn and enjoying watching them burst into tadpoles. And then we have the reinforcement of this little innocent boy, this idea that he absolutely loves sort of being at school, and this idea of a daddy frog and a mammy frog. So what we can see here then, don't worry, the last verse is much shorter, is do you see that rather than be one big long stanza, it's been separated into two? Now, to me, this almost looks like, because obviously there's only two words in that line and there's this little gap here. To me, this almost looks like someone's taken the poem and ripped it in two. Because if you got rid of this gap, you could almost slot them together. Now, I always think that's quite interesting, because what this is it's a very sudden sort of break. And what I always think here is the sudden break in the stanzas. Remember, stanzas is a verse, so that's a stanza, that's a stanza. Could represent, sorry, that didn't spell represent very well there, his change of view of nature. Because just like we predicted, in this second stanza, we have that change of view. And this break here could represent that suddenly, one day this boy has woken up and he's viewed it differently. So we're just going to look at this final verse, but you will notice there is no positive representations of nature here. It's all described negatively. Then one hot day when fields were rank with cow dung. So rank, again, is just telling us that it smells disgusting. So it's like maybe a year or several years have passed and he's gone back to this pond, as he's done every year, to collect the frog spawn. But suddenly something has changed, or the way that he views nature, because he's got older, has changed. In the grass, the angry frogs invaded the flax dam. Remember, the flax dam is just this bank of earth and rotted plants around this pond. So he's now scared of the frogs because he views them as angry. Now we have to think here, and the question I'd be asking you if we were in class now, why does he now view the frogs as angry? And I would say to you, he spent years stealing their babies, essentially. You know, frog spawn are baby frogs. They're filled with tadpoles. By stealing those eggs, he has essentially stolen their potential children. And whilst these tadpoles may have hatched in this jam jar, we do not know what then happened to them. They likely all died, because tadpoles are not going to survive very long in a jam jar filled with water. They need to be returned to a pond where they'll eventually grow into frogs. It's unlikely that's what happened. So what we have here is essentially he feels guilty for stealing their eggs. Now, when he was younger, he wouldn't have comprehended or understood that that's something you should feel guilty for. Just like very young children don't have the same sense of right and wrong as an older child or an adult. But now he's begun to lose that innocence. The way he views nature is changed because of his own guilt, because he understands he shouldn't really be messing around with these eggs. And that guilt and that sense of being in the wrong is why he views these frogs, something he once loved, as something that is threatening and frightening to him. This idea of invaded is almost like war. You know, you'd think of war as invading soldiers. I ducked through the hedges. So ducked could mean, you know, he's got taller. Again, this idea of getting older. He's got taller and therefore has to duck. And because he's got older and taller, that's why he's lost his innocent view of nature. To a coarse croaking that I had not heard before. So he's viewing nature differently. You know, now he's viewing nature differently. The air was thick with a bass chorus. That's just the sound of the frogs croaking. Right down on the dam, gross-bellied frogs were cocked on sods. Cocked, it makes you think of a gun. So on sods of earth, you know, these clumps of earth. So it's almost as if these frogs could be used as weapons. Their loose necks pulsed like sails. So again, we have this disgusting imagery. You know, they're gross. You've got their sort of necks pulsing. Again, if you've seen a frog croak, then you'll know what that looks like. Some hopped. The slap and plop were obscene threats. So if something is a threat, it can cause you danger. And he says here, some sat poised like mugged grenades, their blunt heads farting. So again, he feels they are a danger to him. And that's essentially what happens in the rest of this poem. I sickened, turned, and ran. You know, he's now disgusted by nature. He feels it's a danger to him. And the reason why he feels it's a danger to him is the great slime kings, the frogs, were gathered there for vengeance. You know, revenge. Revenge for stealing their eggs. And I knew that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it. So he now thinks if he put his hand into that pond, those frogs would grab his hand and pull him under and probably kill him. So again, that's all linking in to this idea that he feels that they are a danger to him. So what we see essentially in this poem is that nature and the way an innocent child views nature, that is being used to show the loss of innocence. Because as this boy has got older and he's lost that innocent view of nature, the way he views nature has changed. Just like as we get older, the way we view the world around us changes. And that is really what he's doing here. That's your key to understanding this poem. He uses nature and this little boy that loves collecting frog spawn, but he is essentially robbing and probably killing these frogs' babies. As a little child, he doesn't understand that that's the wrong thing to do. But as he gets older and as he loses his innocence, he realizes that he shouldn't have done that. And that's why he now views these frogs in such a dangerous, frightening way and eventually runs away because he feels now that guilt of adulthood or getting older.